Okay, y'all, buckle up because it's pretty amazing how they solved this 5,300-year-old murder. So in the previous video, we talked about a guy called Otzi the Iceman who was found while two hikers were hiking in 1991. He was a perfectly preserved mummy. And if you haven't seen that video, follow this comment back and go take a look. As I mentioned in the previous video, 10 years after they found him, they noticed that he had been murdered. And then they called in the experts to try to solve it. So the first thing I'll share with you is that Otzi was found so close to the Austrian-Italian border that they actually had to bring experts in to try to determine who he belonged to. So after the surveyors came out, they determined that Otzi was 92 meters inside the Italian borders, and for Americans, that's less than one football field. And that's because as Americans, we for some reason like to measure things in football fields. Otzi was in incredibly amazing shape. Down to his stomach contents, they were able to determine so many things about him, including where he had been in the last 24 hours, what he had eaten, where it came from, all of that kind of stuff. He's what was considered a wet mummy, not a dry, dehydrated one, which is why everything was still intact. So the first thing that the investigators noticed was that Otzi had not seemed to be in any type of tensed up distress or anything like that when he died, meaning that whatever happened to him, he wasn't expecting it. And it turned out that he was shot from behind with an arrow. He was also about 45 years old, which in the Copper Age would consider him to be elderly. The other thing that they noticed about him is that he had a cut on his hand that had been relatively fresh at the time of his death, but had just started to heal up a little bit. They also put him through a CT scan and noticed that he had a couple of fresh broken ribs on his right. The arrow hit a main artery, meaning that he bled out probably in 2 minutes or less, so it was a very quick death. They also noticed that on the back of his head, it was indented, like it was caved in slightly. But in the same CT scan that showed his ribs had been freshly broken at the time of his death, it showed something else, that there was a bleed at the base of the brain that corresponded with the indentation in the back of his head. Between the arrow and the back of his head, it was determined that Otzi did not die accidentally, that it was definitely a violent act committed against him. Now that we know his life was taken, what was the motive? Well, all of his possessions were still with him, so it wasn't robbery. They also noticed something else. All of Otzi's arrows were intact, but the one that was in his neck was missing the shaft that it would have been on, meaning that somebody would have taken it out. They were perfectly preserved, so it would make sense that this shaft should have been perfectly preserved if it had been left there. Back in those days, though, the markings that would have been on that arrow and on that shaft could have easily led to whose it was, kind of like forensic analysis on a bullet. And similarly, taking Otzi's possessions would have stuck out like a sore thumb. They would have known that those were Otzi's things, and why did this person have it, making them a prime suspect. That's really interesting is that according to the investigator, when Otzi was first found, his arms were stretched out. And he said with all the cadavers he's ever seen, he's never seen one with his arms stretched out, meaning that he was put in that position. So with all that information, here's what they believe happened. The day before Otzi got into an altercation in the village, that's where the gash on his hand came from and the broken ribs on his right. He then packed up all of his things and decided to flee across the mountains. There, he was met by his attackers, shot in his neck. He then bled out and died. The attackers then came over, rolled him over, and broke the shaft off to take it with them and get rid of the evidence. They then also caved in the back of his head to make sure that the job was done. It was found it would have been near impossible to make that shot with an arrow, so it's believed that he was killed somewhere else and then drugged to his final resting place in position with his arms outstretched. He was then covered with ice and snow and left there, never to be found, except we did find him 5,300 years later. Now it would be near impossible to know who did it and the exact reason why they got into an altercation and why they chose to take Otzi's life. But can we admit that it's pretty freaking incredible that they were able to basically solve a 5,300-year-old murder based on just finding this body?